All right, Claudia, last snap. All right. All right, Ray, put it away.
All right, I think we're ready to get started. Ooh, there we go. Well, welcome to period 5 of Writers Week 30. Welcome. Clap it up. Writers Week 30. 30 years that this has been going on. Started with Mr. Anderson, Mr. Gary Anderson, Mr. Romano, who had this tradition going, and another Mr. Anderson, Mr. Russell Anderson, and Miss Gina Inc. continue to keep this tradition going. So a big round of applause for them. We also have your fabulous English teachers who put in many hours of work to get this thing going. The administration that allows us to do this great thing that you can't find anywhere else. And of course, the wonderful writers that come here, and yourselves, and your parents, and the boosters. Give a round of applause for yourselves and your parents. Our author today is getting ready to launch her 4th novel. Yeah. The title of her new novel is called The Great Divide, and she has 3 others previous to that: The World in Half, Come Together, Fall Apart, and of course, The Book of Unknown Americans. As far as, hey, maybe picking up a copy of her work, I'm going to pass the mic to Mrs. Williamson.
All right, hey guys, I'm Mrs. Williamson. Really quick, if you are looking to purchase one of the books from the author that you're hearing from, we will have 2 titles available for pre-order. One of the titles we will have copies in just a couple days. The other is the newest novel that Mr. Heritage was talking about. So to pre-order the book, you'll just come down to see me. We'll have The Book of Unknown Americans for $16 and The Great Divide for $30, and that one will be released on March 5th, so you'll get that one a little later. We are accepting cash or credit, and later on this week we will have capabilities for Apple Pay. All right, so come down at the end of the period.
One last round of applause for today's author, Christina Enriquez. So it's interesting, one thing that I've seen a story about, kind of going back to the very beginning. You've mentioned it in a few different interviews before, but how you kind of got started on this path of writing involving a boy in a notebook. If you could maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yes? Okay, yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. Now it's really on. Okay. Yeah, the way that I started writing was actually in high school when I was about all of your ages. There was a boy who I liked. And when I tell you that I liked him, I mean that I was like soul-crushingly in love with him. He and I were friends, and we would hang out and like play ping pong together, and sometimes we would sit in study hall and do the New York Times crossword puzzle together, and sometimes we would play Scrabble together, and one time he played the word bivouac, and because I was such a word nerd even back then, I was like, oh my god, I love you. And I decided at some point that I should try to tell him how I felt about him, and so we would be at a party, and I would somehow like shuffle him into a corner, and I would tell him, I really like you. Or I would call him late at night after my parents were asleep, and I would tell him, I really like you. And he got really sick of that. So he came into school one day with a blank notebook that he had bought, and he walked up to me in the hallway. I still remember I was standing by the water fountain, and he handed me this notebook, and he said, why don't you write down everything you want to say to me for a year, and then give this back to me. And I was like, okay. So I took the notebook home with me, and I started writing in it. And at first, the entries were really like just to him, you know? They were like, how great he looked at calculus that day, or whatever. But after a few weeks, what I realized is I just loved writing. Like just the sheer act of writing. And And it was an amazing thing for me because in the notebook, I could say anything I wanted to say. I could use language that my parents would have killed me for using usually. It was totally different than writing like essays for school. It was a place of like freedom for me. And so I did write in it for that full year. And everybody always wants to know, did I give it back to him? And I did. And he read it, and nothing happened. And that was okay, because what had happened instead was that I fell out of love with this boy, and I fell in love with writing instead. And I really never looked back. I just bought notebooks after that, but I kept writing in and using them as journals. By the time I left for college, I thought that I wanted to be a writer. I didn't really know what that would look like. I thought maybe I wanted to be a poet, so I took some poetry classes, and then it turned out I was really, really terrible at poetry. I took some fiction classes after that, and that felt better. But it was sort of like a meandering path, and it all started back with that notebook and that boy. I think, would have found my way to it eventually anyway, but it was a real gift to have that notebook in my life where I could like see the impact and the pleasure of just writing like that for myself. And then he and I stayed friends, and a number of years back, he gave me the notebook back. So I have it still, and I try not to read it because when I look at it, it's like so cringeworthy. But it really is this like great document, of a time that ended up being like very foundational for me.
When you talk about that process of journaling, when did you sense that? Was it mostly about just thoughts, ideas, things that happened to you in everyday life, and when did that kind of transition into the idea of fiction?
I think at first it was really just like a recording of the day's events. It was like, this person did this, and then I went here, and then, blah, blah, blah. Eventually, when I realized, I think, that like no one was going to be reading it, that I could really just do whatever I want, that played a sort of trick in my mind where I was like, I can experiment here. I can just kind of mess around. And so I started writing poems, because at the time, like, that is what I kind of thought I wanted to do, is be a poet. And I would like just write out, there were sort of like song lyrics, sort of like poems in the notebook. And I think I didn't get to fiction until I started actually taking fiction classes. But something creative was happening in the journal, after a few weeks of just kind of the like day-to-day recording of things.
As far as that process of journal writing, is it something you still do today?
I don't write in a journal, but this next book that's coming out in March, I wrote the whole thing by hand. And that was an interesting process because, so for my first 3 books, including the Book of Unknown Americans, which I think some of you have read, I wrote those 3 on a computer. And then after the Book of Unknown Americans came out and I was thinking about what am I going to do next, I got into a place where I was really stuck. Like for the first time in my writing career, I was just like absolutely stuck, and everything that I was trying to write was absolute drivel. So I had that kind of going on, and I kept like sitting down every day, and I would kind of keep trying to push through, and it just wasn't going anywhere. And then one day I went and bought a pair of pants. And I didn't know it at the time, but the store that I was buying the pants from was running a promotion where they would give you a free notebook. I guess if you bought a pair of pants or if you spent a certain amount of money. I still don't know this to this day. But I walked out of the store that day with the pants and a notebook. And I really thought I didn't need this notebook because I'm a little bit of a notebook hoarder. Like I have a lot of notebooks that I buy very like carefully in gift shops and stationery stores, and then I just save all of them, and they're too beautiful or they're too cool to actually write in, and so they just sort of sit there. But I was like, I don't need another notebook. So I brought it home, and I thought to myself, well, I'll give it to my husband, or maybe I'll give it to a friend, or whatever. I sat it on my nightstand in the meantime before I could figure out what to do with it exactly. And then that night, as I was falling asleep, I was trying again to like untangle the knots of this novel that was going so badly. And a sentence occurred to me. and I needed to write it down, so I like sat up and I like scribbled it on the notebook, which just happened to be there. Normally when that happens, like when I have a late night, moment of insight, the next morning it's really like, it's just so bad. Like it's just like immediately like cross it out, like what was I thinking? But I looked at it again the next morning, and the sentence that I had written was actually like decent. And it was maybe the best thing I had written in like months. All these months of being like really stuck with this book. And when I saw that the sentence was decent, I instantly decided like the notebook is magic, right? So for whatever reason, like my brain just went to like, I can only write in this notebook, apparently. So I would carry that notebook around with me everywhere, and I was writing in it. And when I filled it up, I sent my husband to the same store to buy another pair of pants, because I was like, I need notebooks only from that store, apparently, to be able to write properly. And he went and he got it, and I wrote in that notebook and I filled it up. And by the time I filled up that notebook, the promotion was over, so I had to find my own notebooks. And I bought a notebook that was unlined then that next time. So it had like, it was just like a total blank page. And I kept writing, I wrote in that, and then something weird happened when I was writing in the notebooks that had no lines, which is that all my sentences started to go like sideways and diagonal, and then I was drawing like looping arrows over to other things, and then I was like writing in like tiniest pockets of space imaginable, and it was just like this wild thicket of disorder, which was essentially, it was like my brain on the page, right? But what that did was connected me back to that original feeling of the journal, which was this like freedom. As opposed to like when I'm typing on a computer, you get to the computer, I'm sure you've all had this experience, you have to like write an essay for a class or something, you get to the computer and you're like, okay, like this is official, my teacher's gonna read this, I am typing. It's sort of like, it feels kind of like mechanical, right? But in the notebook, I was like all over the place, I was doing whatever I wanted, and it played the same trick, which is like, this is a notebook I keep on my bedside table, no one's gonna read this. So I can do whatever I want. And it really like cracked open something in me. And then I like went ahead, I put that book that I was really stuck on, ended up still being like just trash, so it's somewhere in my computer. But I kept writing by hand when I decided that I wanted to write this next book that's coming out, and I filled up like 5 notebooks worth, and that was the novel. And eventually, you have to like move it over to the computer. You can't just like send your notebooks full of like handwriting and scribbles to your editor. But every day I would get up and I would just like huddle over this notebook with my little pen, and there was like no distractions, no internet, it never needed to be charged, it didn't have to be taken out of my bag in the airport, it was always just like ready and available. And so that's how I wrote this book.
I know for us as an audience, when we read a book, it's finalized, it's been edited, it's been revised, and we get that final product. And sometimes with us, we get in our heads like, oh wow, everything's so perfect on the page. Sometimes it's easy for people to think, oh, it must have come out that way. You talked about, yeah, exactly. You talked about the editing process before. I can't remember which novel it was, but I think you said you had some like 400 pages that you presented to your editor at one point, and basically your editor was like, all right, you need to rewrite it. I mean, that process of when you think you have something down there, you know something's not quite right, that editing process, when you hear something like that, do you sense it, like, okay, I need to do it, or when you hear someone kind of say that, is that like a crushing blow, and how do you deal with that feedback?
Yeah, it's always a crushing blow. Like, if someone says, like, you wrote 400 pages and none of it works, it's like you just got punched in the gut. It's like, okay. So I just spent, like, years of my life doing this thing. But I also tried really hard to believe, and I do believe this, that none of it is wasted, right? Like, I was just practicing for that number of years. And the next thing that I write is only going to be better because of it. And that's okay. This one didn't work out, but the next one might. You sort of have to just have that faith that at some point it's going to work out. But yeah, the editing is hard. I mean, if only the book could just like come out in the order that you guys see it, like all those words just like happen happened to arrive in my brain in that order, that would be incredible. But my process seems to be that I write twice as much as what the book ends up being. So I usually have two files going. One is like the book file, and then the other is what I call like a notes file. So whatever like gets cut at some point, I never delete anything. Like, do not delete anything. I like just move it over to the notes file. And then the notes file, by the time I've finished a book, is actually almost always twice as long as the book file is. So, you know, there's a lot of writing, and some of it's like not just some of it's at the level of like, does the sentence work? And some of it's like, where does everything go? That's a lot of the editing too. Like I'll write a scene and I'll be like, this is the right scene. I know this works. But where the heck does it go? I can't figure that out yet. And sometimes you just need an editor, you know, and if you're lucky, you get somebody who's like really engaged with your work and can help you figure all of that stuff out. But yeah, it's a process.
The act of writing, I know with a lot of writers, the actual action of writing sometimes works its way into the story itself. I'm thinking the Book of Unknown Americans, you have Maribel, who's got her notebook, and obviously she's got it more for a therapy, but that idea of having a notebook and her ideas, writing it down, and then that collection of thoughts and ideas that go into that, did that play into like a personal part of you as well as your ability to write into a notebook and kind of have that creative energy that comes from that?
It's interesting. I've actually never made that connection, but it probably has to do with just my affinity toward notebooks and writing by hand like that, and like what they can do for you and what they can show you about yourself. That's probably in some kind of like subconscious level how that worked its way into that book. I mean, in this new book, I have people writing letters a little bit, like you see some of those. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm just enamored by like writing and the act of writing. So I think it's natural that that kind of stuff shows up sometimes in my work.
We were talking about the high school setting before and people's different encounters with that. And I know that I've read that you moved around a bit in your adolescence, but you talk about Delaware as kind of like a center. Was most of your high school experience in Delaware?
Yes, all of my high school was in Delaware. Newark High School in Newark, Delaware for 4 years. Yep.
And what was that experience like as a student in Delaware in this high school setting? What was your high school experience like? And obviously writing, you found it there. How did those two jive together?
Yeah, I mean, I was, like, my high school was a public high school that was, the graduation rate was like 50%. We didn't have any AP classes. I'd never heard of what an AP class was. Like, I got to college and all these people had like AP credits, and I was like, what is that? I've never even heard of that. Like, so it was a school where I had some teachers, some English teachers who were amazing and rigorous and who turned me on to certain things about literature. But it was also a high school where, like, I think not a lot of teachers were like paying attention to me. Like if you were like kind of getting good enough grades and doing the right things, no one was really paying attention to you. And so I kind of felt like I had that experience a little bit. And in a way, that's great. Like you have a sort of kind of anonymity. You can do the things that, you know, like I could sign up for classes, like an art class that maybe in a more rigorous school environment, you know, some counselor, if I had had a counselor, which I didn't, would have like steered me like, oh, you should actually do this instead because it'll be better for your college transcript, you know. So I kind of got to explore in a way that I think was great. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, high school was, I liked high school. I didn't feel particularly like an outsider necessarily. I had been with those kids and in that kind of space since like 5th grade is when I moved back to Delaware. You know, so there were a lot of people who I knew and who, you know, some of them are still my friends. But it's funny being here because my daughter is 16, and so she's in high school, she's a junior, and this is like very familiar to me. and she had to read Book of Unknown Americans for school,
Oh.
and much to her chagrin. And so like in class, they had to like watch an interview of me or something. She's like, comes home, she's like, we had to watch an interview of you during school today. And I was like, but does anyone even know that I'm your mom? And she's like, no, but she told like one person, and then of course everybody knew. So it became a little bit of a thing. And then kids were like sending books home with her to our house for me to sign and send back to school and stuff like that. But it was funny. She I think thought it was pretty cringe overall, but you know.
Was there any, obviously, seeing a parent in that creative light, I'm curious, what was her reaction after having read the book? Did she question you about it?
Yeah, she was like, I have to write this report. Can you tell me what's the theme? And I'm like, I don't know, you tell me what's the theme. Like, I'm not gonna do your report for you. So yeah, she was sort of pestering me about it. But you know, she's very kind of reserved in her like expressiveness. So she just kind of was like, yeah, it was good. I'm like, okay, thanks.
The reason I brought up high school too, I'm looking at my 625 senior composition class. Hi everybody, how are you doing? And they're in this transition from high school to college. And this idea of, hey, you know, it's really easy to get lost in the idea of, all right, I'm going off to this place that's going to prepare me for the real world, and what do I want to do? Some people know, some people have an idea or think they have an idea, and you're going into college at Northwestern University. You kind of talked about that idea of not necessarily thinking about fiction exactly, but knowing you enjoy writing. What was the path in your head?
I knew I liked writing, and I had told my parents that, and they, I think, were very concerned that I would never get a job. You know? So my dad was suggesting that maybe I should be a journalism major, because then I could still write, but presumably I'd have a paycheck, you know, or some kind of salary. You know, Northwestern has a great journalism school, which was probably part of the reason that I was interested in it. But I just knew I just didn't really want to do journalism. So I got to Northwestern, and I didn't want to do journalism, so I didn't go that direction. But I was actually pretty afraid to be an English major, you know? It just didn't sound like it was going to be like, I don't know, that lucrative, or it's like, it was, I guess, planted in my mind, like what job would I get if I was an English major? So I actually first declared psych as my major, because I was interested in like human behavior. You know, I think writers naturally are. So I was a psychology major at first, and then I took all these science classes that you have to take to be a psych major. And I was like, whoa, this is not it. Like, I can't do these. So I decided, I talked to a friend actually. I had a really good friend who just kind of looked me in the eye and was like, listen, you love English. You know that you do. Go be an English major. And so I went and I talked to my counselor at Northwestern, and I said, I need to switch my major, and I switched to English. Then I learned, after all of this, that in the English department, they had an undergraduate creative writing major. But you had to apply to get into it. Most people do it like their junior year. It's like a sequence of classes that you do to complete the major. So I applied my sophomore year, and I got rejected. And I was like really devastated. I didn't really know. I thought actually, the way I interpreted it was, the universe is trying to tell me something. This is not what I'm meant to do with my life. I guess I'll just continue being an English major, and that's that. Then I was at an event on campus, like a poetry reading, in fact, where my old poetry professor, because I had taken a poetry class by then, again, thinking that that's what I wanted to do, she came up to me and she said to me, do you think you might apply again for the major? I didn't even know that was a possibility, that you could do it your senior year. And we didn't even really have like a full discussion about it. She just asked that question, and because she asked the question, I applied again. And the second time I applied, then I got into the major. And I was like so happy, because I had been seeing like all the writing majors. I knew who they were walking around campus, and I just like really wanted to be part of them. And so then, even though I was a little bit of a loser doing it my senior year, I guess, I got to do it, and yeah, that was like my college experience of figuring out my way toward writing, I guess. Yeah, I will also say that before all of that, I remember, like, I was so kind of lost. I just had this very vague idea. Writing, what is that? I remember having a college interview for like a pretty like prestigious college, and the guy came to our house, and we were sitting in the living room, which we like never used, but he was sitting there, and he was like, "I hear you like to write. What do you write?" And I said, "Letters." And like, I did not get into that school, so I don't know. Yeah.
That idea of rejection, it's something that every writer, whether they're ever published or not, experiences. I mean, that's part of the process. And then that idea also that you could write all this stuff out, but no one may ever read it. How did you kind of process that in your head with that idea that, hey, maybe this will never be published. Maybe I'm writing and no one's ever going to see it. And a lot of people have a hard time internalizing that. But was it just the joy and the love of it that was really getting you going regardless of all that?
Yeah, when I was there's a quick story about that you reminded me of. So when I was in graduate school, so I was at Iowa, and we were so fortunate. Sometimes these like amazing writers would come and visit. And one of the writers who came one day was Kurt Vonnegut. And we sat in a classroom, which was like very small, just like a regular classroom size. And it was all the writing workshop students, and Kurt Vonnegut at the front, and he was like smoking inside, and no one told him to stop because he's Kurt Vonnegut. And he told this story about how if you know you're a writer, if you can sit down and write the best thing you have ever written, just like labor over it, and you get every word just where you want it, and you take that paper out behind your apartment to the dumpster, and you tear it up into 100 pieces, and you throw it away. And it's so extreme, but like the idea that the reason that you should be doing this thing is not because there's something at the end of it that you have to show other people, but because there's some joy in the process of doing it. That really like resonated with me, and that's something that I think about all of the time. I mean, the past 5 years that I've been working on this new novel, and I've just been like huddled over those notebooks and like really just hanging out with imaginary people for 5 years, like that has been the most joyful experience of my writing career, to just like be that close with them and with that material. And whatever else happens with the book is, it's not up to me anymore. It's like, whatever happens will happen. But that was never the point. The point is always just the sitting down, the writing, and sometimes you stumble upon those things that are like you articulate something in a way that you didn't know you could. Or you write something that's like beyond you, right? That feels like, oh my God, this is like better than something that I thought I could write. And when you have those little moments, like that to me makes the whole thing worth it.
I told Mrs. Zika I'd work in a question involving a passage of your writing, and this is my reach to do that now. But obviously you found success. You're coming on into your fourth novel. Looking back at your third novel, which you have right there, obviously you love, it's yours. The whole experience is yours. Was there a certain part or passage or moment of the text that that in your head invokes a particular emotion that makes you stronger than others?
Oh, I mean, I have my favorite parts of it,
Okay.
for sure. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. There's oh gosh, now I'm gonna have to find it quickly. I love the scene during Christmas when the power goes out and they're all hanging out together. Let's see. Hold on a second.
And then, audience, get a couple questions in the last 5 minutes or so to save for you. So get something good in your head, and I'm going to reach out to you.
I'm not going to read something long. This is the one line in the book, though. Well, I guess I'll read this whole paragraph. But this is the final line of this paragraph. I remember when I wrote it, it felt like some kind of electricity shot through me. It was one of those moments where I was like, oh, I was able to like capture in words something that I had so nebulously felt, but I was able to like get it down on paper. And so this is in Mayor's voice when he's talking about kind of the disjunction between being born in Panama but feeling like he belongs in the United States. And his father's telling him, you know, you were born in Panama, it's in your bones. I spent a lot of time trying to find it in me, but usually I couldn't. I felt more American than anything, but even that was up for debate, according to the kids at school who taunted me over the years, asking me if I was related to Noriega, telling me to go back through the canal. The truth was that I didn't know which I was. I wasn't allowed to claim the thing I felt, and I didn't feel the thing I was supposed to claim. I think that just like resonated with me and my own experience of being born in the United States, but not being like labeled as Panamanian American, you know, which I am, but like being seen in the way that was like limiting to other people sometimes, or then going to Panama and my cousins telling me that I was gringa, like just this always feeling of like, where do I belong between these two places? And I think that giving some of that to Mayor was cathartic for me. And yeah, that final line was one of those kind of like, yay, like I got something there, yeah.
A beautiful passage and a beautiful book. Audience members, who has a question? Who has a question? Right there, we got.
How did you overcome criticism and hardship?
How did I overcome criticism and hardships? I mean, honestly, one of the hardest things about being a writer, I think, is every day you are sort of battling a little bit with self-doubt. And that self-doubt can come, obviously, from outside voices, and it can be like engendered by that. So I think for me, it's important to just sort of like keep my head down and focus on the work and like keep that stuff out. At this point, I don't read any reviews. I don't have any social media. I've never gone to my Amazon pages. Like, none of that is my business, really. I think. My business is to like stay with the work, look at what's in front of me. Actually, this reminds me, I'll read this too. This is a quote that I have, I carry it around with me. It's from Martha Graham, who is an amazing dance choreographer and dancer herself. It's from her biography, but it's sort of like a pep talk that I give myself in this regard about writing and about creating. And so for any of you who are writers or creators in any way, this might resonate. I read this to myself like once a week, probably. There is a vitality, a life force, a quickening that is translated through you into action. And because there is only one of you in all time, this expression becomes unique. If you block it, it will never exist through any medium and be lost. The world will not have it. It is not your business to determine how good it is, nor how it compares with other expressions. It is your business to keep it yours, clearly and directly, to keep the channel open. You do not even have to believe in yourself or your work. You have to keep directly open to and aware of the urges that move you. Keep the channel open. No artist is pleased. There is no satisfaction whatever at any time. There is only a queer divine dissatisfaction, a blessed unrest that keeps us marching and makes us more alive than the others. And it's just like a good reminder to me. You know, it's like, it's not my concern, all the sort of noise that would like swirl around or anything that people would say. Like, I have the trusted people I know, and of course I'm gonna like listen to criticism, I'm gonna listen to feedback. I always want to get better at my craft and the thing that I'm doing. But, you know, all the kind of media circus of noise, if you were, that's the stuff you just kind of, just like put your blinders on. That's not your business.
That's a fantastic question. I have maybe one, maybe two more. Another one right there.
I think that of all the perspective in Unknown Americans, the one I connected with the most is probably Mayor, and for the reasons that I said, because some of the things that he's dealing with, some of the challenges he has in his life are things that connect to me personally, especially in terms of identity. And he's also the voice that first came to me when I was writing the book. Like the way that things happen for me, like the entry point is always through language. And so a sentence will like arrive in my head, like fully formed. And the sentence that arrived for this book was, "We heard they were from Mexico." That's Mayor's voice. I didn't know it was Mayor at the time. You know, I just heard the sentence and I wrote it down, and then your job is to like follow it, right? Like what's the next sentence after that? Like listen to the first one and respond to it somehow. And then that's how you get your second sentence. And you just keep doing that until you have enough and you can start to like hear the book. Or that's how the experience is for me. And so, yeah, Mayor was the like original kind of impulse behind the whole thing. And like I said, because of some of the challenges and the things he's thinking about in his life, and the things that I've thought about for like my whole life, I felt connected to him.
I have time for one last question. Up top.
What was your favorite book to write out of the three? And tú hablas español un poquito con tu familia?
I don't speak Spanish that much with my family. I mean, when we go to Panama, I speak with my cousins and my aunts and uncles and like, you know, to the best of my ability. I'm not 100% fluent. And so like my dad will say to me, he'll be like, "Cristina, ¿qué hubo?" And I'm like, "Fine, I'm fine." Like I answer in English, so yeah, I don't know, that's how that goes. But my favorite of the books to write was this newest one. It was just a really sort of magical, special experience. So I hope you look out for it. Thank you.
Thank you